At least one person is dead and about 20 are wounded after a Russian missile strike in Odesa, Ukraine. The attack hit Odesa's historic city center, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It destroyed 6 houses and apartment buildings and also damaged the city's largest cathedral. Odesa sits on the Black Sea and has Ukraine's biggest port. Russia pulled out from a grain deal last week and has since destroyed 60,000 tons of grain in Odesa, according to officials. Russia and Ukraine are both warning of potential military attacks on ships in the Black Sea. Those recent events have raised fears of a major food crisis for millions around the world. For more on this, we've reached Andrew Rasoulis. He's a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a retired Department of National Defense official. Andrew, there are concerns about the global grain supply that's driving wheat prices higher. And at a time when food inflation is already a worry for so many, what's your reaction to Russia using hunger as a weapon?
Well, they're using what they can use, and they're trying to pressure the West to do sanctions relief. Now, the Russians have complained since the beginning of this deal, which was signed last year, that the sanctions that the West have imposed on them make it difficult, not impossible, but difficult for the Russians to implement it. So they're looking for sanctions relief in terms of the bank that deals with the financial aspects of the grain deal to be reconnected to the SWIFT banking system. They're looking for sanctions relief on parts for agriculture equipment that they can use then to, harvest the wheat. And they are looking for sanctions relief that would make it easier for Russian vessels internationally to get insurance when they ship their wheat. So they've complained. The West has said they've got a deal that they should abide by. The Russians said it's not sufficient. And they're basically using these attacks to pressure the West to do what the Russians have been after, which is, as I said, sanctions relief.
Many of Russia's allies rely on grain from Ukraine. How will this affect them?
Well, it will. And this is a very tricky balance for the Russians because they have very strong foreign policy interests in certain countries of the global south, in Africa, and most notably South Africa. And so the Russians have assured them, when before Putin canceled this deal or refused to reaffirm the deal, he called the president of South Africa to give him a heads up. So the Russians are trying to balance their interests. Now, the Russians have also said that they are working on a bilateral mechanism to keep the Russian food grains flowing to the global south. How plausible that is, I don't know, but the Russians have been talking about it. But really, the focus here will be in August, when the BRICS meeting will take place in South Africa, and Turkish President Erdogan is going to Moscow to meet with Putin on this subject. So there still may be a deal where the Russians come back to the grain deal, if, of course, the Russians get some measure of sanctions relief. And that's part of the negotiations that are ongoing right now.
And as we see these attacks on Odesa, will we see more of this war playing out at sea going forward?
Well, it could, because with the cancellation of the grain deal, both the Ukrainians and the Russians have basically declared that there are no longer safe passage routes through the Black Sea. And both sides have said that any vessels, civilian or otherwise, approaching each other's ports would be considered or could be considered as vessels carrying weapons and therefore subject to military attack.
Meanwhile, the U.S. has confirmed that Ukraine is now using cluster bombs. These can hit a wide area and potentially hurt civilians. Will this change NATO's support for Ukraine?
No, they've gotten over this. This was an irritant at the NATO summit in Vilnius, where some countries like Canada, for example, and the UK disapprove of these weapons. So the political situation was addressed. The Americans were adamant that the Ukrainian shortage of ammunition required the Americans to send these weapons, recognizing they are controversial. But I think people have gotten over that aspect. The weapons are being delivered, they are being used, and the consequences, militarily and humanitarian consequences, will simply be there.